Welcome back, and we're going to continue our discussion here on Chapter 4 with exercise metabolism. In this particular video, we're going to discuss respiratory exchange quotient, also known as RER or R, and the factors that govern fuel selection. In the past couple of videos, we've discussed about this concept of oxygen ventilatory measurements. But to this point, we've not really discussed on how it is measured. And we're going to take a step back and discuss this because this is a key concept to understand the respiratory exchange ratio, which is one of the key components of this lecture. So when we talk about this measurement of oxygen ventilation, you'll typically see it written as V dot O2. And so when we see this term V dot, it means it's a measurement of flow. And so this measurement is written in liters per minute. And so essentially what we're saying is we are measuring the liters of oxygen breathed per minute. In the previous video, we discussed this idea of VO2 max. And what VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen utilized by the muscles in the body. And so what we're saying is VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that the body can use in liters per minute. And this is how it ties back into the oxygen ventilatory measurement concept. Now, the other side of this is how do we measure, the flow of oxygen? Well, with the advent of technology, we have the ability to do it in the lab and out in the field. So V.O2 is measured with this technology called metabolic carts. And so some of these metabolic carts can be mobile, like we see here with the K5 Cosmet system, or they can be stationary, like we have in our current lab here at Radford. But no matter what system they use, they give the same information. They give V.O2 and V.CO2. And so this means we get the flow of oxygen inhaled and the flow of carbon dioxide exhaled per breath. This is important because this helps us calculate the respiratory exchange ratio, or RER. And so with these measurements of carbon dioxide and oxygen, we can calculate RER. And the equation for RER is V.CO2 over V.O2. And so what we're saying is we're creating a ratio of the expired CO2 over the inspired oxygen, or O2. And so why is RER, or respiratory exchange quotient, such an important concept? Well, during steady state exercise, and I can't express this more enough, we're talking primarily only in steady state exercise, it allows the researcher and the athlete to know fuel selection. And what I mean by this, it allows us to know if the body is using primarily fats or carbohydrates as the fuel source. And this is a really cool concept because it allows us to know what energy pathway is being used to be able to create ATP during the exercise. And it can give us further information to better enhance performance through the right nutrition. And so what we find is typically when a person or an athlete is at rest, the typical RER equals 0.7. And so what this means is the expired CO2 is less than the inspired O2. And so what this means is the primary pathway when we see increased oxygen is aerobic or oxidative phosphorylation, and so to create ATP. And so what is the fuel source that we discussed in previous videos that gives us a lot of ATP? Well, that fuel source is going to be fats. Now, there is a fancy calculation to show you how we get to this number of 0.7, but we're not going to get into it. You can find that in the textbook. But it is important to understand is you really don't see the RER less than 0.7. It can range a little bit, but on average, it doesn't get any lower than this. So let's make an example. And let's say we take our athlete and we have them run at threshold or lactate threshold. So we're talking about this concept again of where they're running at their maximum amount of lactate production and clearance, which is what we introduced in previous videos. And so what we see when someone is running at a steady state lactate threshold is their RER equals 1.0. And so what this means is the expired CO2 is equal to the inspired O2. And so we're still aerobic at this point. However, we're getting close to the upper portion of the aerobic pathway. And so as we get closer and closer to 1, we need to create more ATP quicker, right? And so we said previously that it takes a lot to create ATP from fats as the fuel source. And so the body starts to transition to carbohydrates as the source of fuel as we get closer and closer to RER of 1.0. And so what we have here is figure 4.1 from the textbook. And it starts off with the RER or R at 0.70. And so what we see here is when the RER is equal to or less than 0.70, the amount of fats or percentage of fats as the primary fuel source is 100%. Now, as the intensity of the exercise increases and the RER ratio changes and gets closer and closer to 1, what we see is the percent of fats decreases and the amount of carbohydrates as the fuel source increases. And so as we get closer and closer to 1.0 and beyond that, the primary fuel source is carbohydrates. And so what we say is the range for measuring fats versus carbohydrates of the fuel source ranges from 0.70 to 1.0. And anything lower than 0.70 is all fats. And everything above 1.0 is going to be carbohydrates. Additionally, another concept that RER helps to solidify is this concept of intensity versus duration in the body's fuel selection during exercise. And so what we're seeing here is when the RER is at 0.70, we're primarily at rest. And so what we see here is these values of the RER between 0.70 and 1.0 were completely aerobic. However, as this number increases, the intensity is increasing, right? And as the intensity is increasing, this means our duration is decreasing. And so when we get to this point of 1.0, we can pretty much say that the effort is at lactate threshold. And typically this, depending on the training of the athlete, can only be held for a certain period of time. On the bike, it's typically about 60 minutes. And while running, typically about 45 minutes. And these are just rules of thumb. Now, when we start talking about efforts of the RER values above 1, so the RER is greater than 1.0, the fuel source is going to be 100% carbohydrates. But the intensity is getting very, very high. And this means our duration is starting to get very, very low or very short. And so what you'll see is with the duration getting shorter and shorter with this higher and higher intensity, the athlete reaches fatigue much sooner. And so within this concept of the RER and with the increasing intensity and the shift from fats to carbohydrates as the primary fuel source, we are inadvertently discussing this concept called the crossover concept. And so what this concept describes is the shift from fats to carbohydrates as the primary fuel source as intensity increases. And research shows that this is due to the recruitment of fast-twitch muscle fiber types, and also to the increase of concentrations of catecholamines in the bloodstream. Now, when we look at the factors that govern fuel selection during exercise, and we've introduced this concept a few times, but it all comes down to intensity versus duration. And so, again, let's go back to one of the charts that we discussed in one of the previous videos. In previous videos, we showed with this graph that how intensity increases, duration decreases, right? And within this, we have these different selections of the energy production pathways. For example, we have the usage of stored ATP when intensity is very high, or we're just doing a basic reflex movement and it lasts only about 1 to 2 seconds. From there, we shift over to the phosphocreatine pathway that lasts anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds. And this is due to very high intense situations. Then we cross over into the anaerobic glycolytic pathway that begins roughly at the 10-second mark and lasts upwards to 2 minutes. And then finally, we have the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, or the aerobic pathway, that really ramps up and begins between 1 to 2 minutes and stays as the primary ATP production source until the exercise ends. And also within this, we showed that even if we're completely aerobic for our ATP production, there's still a component of it that is produced through the anaerobic pathways. And so again, we're showing with no matter if it's a high intense situation or a low intense situation where the duration is very long, say a half marathon or marathon, we still have all these different pathways working to create ATP. So far in this video, we've covered a numerous amount of concepts, and let's review these concepts pretty quickly. First, we clarified the concept of ventilatory oxygen measurements and ventilatory carbon dioxide measurements, and that these can lead to the measurement of the respiratory exchange ratio, or RER, or also known as R, measurement, which can give us more information on fuel selection during steady state exercise. And with this information, we can determine if fats or carbohydrates are the primary fuel source. And then finally, we revisit the idea of intensity versus duration as the determining factors for fuel source selection during exercise. I hope this helps. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.